I think a lot of people will hear something like risk algorithm, and they'll think, oh, like computers know the answer, and they'll be able to put their trust into something that they don't fully understand, just because it's so abstract. And what's the alternative? You're going to dive into the mechanisms of risk algorithms. So that was sort of our job, to try and present the information that was pertinent and make it accessible. So talking about, a machine learning, it's only as smart as the data you give it. Computers don't know facts, they don't know truth, they only know how to process the information that you put in. So we, like Zoe was talking about, some of the data is arrest information, which is based on neighborhood, it's based on education, and we know that those things are extremely biased racially, and have been for a long time. Like, that's something that no amount of machine learning is going to be able to counteract.
Welcome to the official podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. In this podcast, students and early career researchers share more about their publication in the journal. Join us weekly to hear from the next generation of STEM leaders as we elevate their voices in science, technology, and innovation policy. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of SciPol SoundBites, a podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. I'm Adriana Bankston, JSPG's Chief Outreach Officer and your host for this podcast. Today, we continue with episodes from the joint issue between JSPG and the AAAS Science and Technology Fellowships Program. Authors we are interviewing today are discussing important topics around healthcare issues and public health. So let's talk a little bit about each publication. So we'll start with Dennis Wieboldt, who is a junior at Boston College studying history and theology. He's the 2020 recipient of the Nicholas Woods Award for Student Leadership and also junior fellow at the Kellogg Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy. The publication in JSPG by Dennis and his co-authors is entitled Illegality and Healthcare, a Federalist Perspective. So Dennis, can you tell us more about your memo and what issues you're seeking to address?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on today. The big problem that my co-author Laura Peralta and I tried to address was how can we create a practical approach to immigrant healthcare that is, first of all, supportive of the nation's overall economic and public health, and at the same time mindful of the overlapping authorities of federal and state actors in both immigration and healthcare. And then thirdly, an approach that's conscious of the serious political divisions that we have in our nation. So the recommendations and the solutions we propose are all oriented around those three broad problems that we see in both immigrant healthcare and the overall public health system in the U.S.
Great. I think it's a very important, very timely issue, especially with the political climate these days. I wonder if you could comment a little more about the immigrant population you're referring to. Do you have demographic data, or are there specific groups that are more affected, or this is directed to more specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So our piece tackles both undocumented immigrants and recent immigrants. There are some laws on the federal level and on state levels which exclude even legal immigrants from healthcare subsidy coverage for the first 5 years after immigration. So that's one issue we address. But broadly speaking, we talk about undocumented individuals, especially the way in which our current healthcare system is oriented around exclusion. So that's both a way to expand definitions of illegality, but at the same time, for example, we cite 42 USC 1396B, which governs Medicaid's application to undocumented individuals. And basically in the law, there's already an exception clause for certain circumstances. But as a product of that, what happens is we exclude immigrants from, preventative care, and as a result, our emergency expenditures increase. So we try to strike a balance between the needs of immigrant healthcare, but also how much United States taxpayers are actually winding up paying.
So next, I want to introduce Zoe Guttman, who is currently completing her PhD in neuroscience at UCLA. Her research stands at the intersection of cognitive neuroscience, behavioral economics, and addition to understand decision-making under conditions of risk and uncertainty. Zoe holds degrees in neuroscience and psychology from NYU and is also the co-founder and president for the Science Policy Group at UCLA. And I'll also introduce Yuki Hebner, who is a third year in the molecular biology PhD program at UCLA, and she studies chromatin remodeling during human corticogenesis to understand the epigenetic drivers of neuropsychiatric diseases. She received her BA and master's in molecular biology and biochemistry from Wesleyan University, and she's currently the vice president for the Science Policy Group at UCLA. And the publication that was co-authored by Zoe, Yuki, and other co-authors is entitled Beyond Cash Bail, Public Health Risk Assessment and California Senate Bill 10. So this seems like a really complicated and important topic. Maybe we can start with Zoe. Can you explain a little bit more about your publication?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having us. Yeah, so our policy memo focuses on the pretrial detention system. So what happens before someone has their trial. And the reason we chose to focus on that was because there was this bill, which was Senate Bill 10, which showed up on the November ballot as Proposition 25, Prop 25. And I think we're all pretty aware of how harmful the mass incarceration epidemic is in terms of physical health, mental health, and just kind of these tangential repercussions. But I know I was really surprised to learn that a huge driver of that is actually pretrial detention. So actually 95% of the increase in jail population over the past couple of decades is because of pretrial detention. So because that was on the ballot and because of this huge issue poses, we were really interested in what the science says about it. And it turns out that Proposition 25 is proposing to use these risk assessment algorithms. They're called actuarial risk assessments. And what they do is they use algorithms to try and determine how risky someone is. So how much, what the likelihood is that they either won't show up for their trial or that they would commit a crime while waiting for their trial if they were to be released. And the problem is that these risk assessment tools are insufficient as of now to accurately determine that risk. And there's a lot of great papers published showing that. So some examples are they use really broad and imprecise definitions of risk. They incorporate a lot of criminal history data that overrepresents non-white defendants. People of color are more likely to be stopped, arrested, prosecuted, convicted for the same conduct as their white counterparts. So when the algorithms use this data, they kind of show a lot more of these people in these databases. So there's a host of reasons that these algorithms are not yet great. So because of that, SB 10 is predicted to perpetuate the same socioeconomic and racial disparities and that the current cash bail system already does. So we recommend opposing cash bail, but opposing Prop 25 in favor of pretrial release for most misdemeanor and nonviolent defendants. And we outline some other areas and counties that have implemented similar reforms, and they haven't seen increases in violent crime or court absences. We also propose that the funding that's currently allocated for pretrial detainment, which is huge, be redirected towards some of these more evidence-based and restorative pretrial services. So there's a lot of great data showing which of these pretrial services are actually effective in helping people show up for their trial. So there was actually a paper published in Science a few weeks ago showing that behavioral nudges, which is this like really simple way of just kind of reminding people about their court date using these reminders, helps people show up instead of these really punitive measures like having someone have to show up for a course every Tuesday at 1 p.m., which would mean they either have to tell their job, there's all these other tangential effects. So we basically outline the data showing which of these pretrial services are effective. And the good news is that most of the ones that we find to be effective are also really cost efficient in helping people show up for trial. So we advocate that a lot of this money be put towards new bail reform legislation in California and transition from a reliance on kind of pretrial detention to pretrial services that can actually mitigate the collateral effects of incarceration while also improving public health, public safety, and saving a lot of money for the taxpayers.
Great, thank you. So you brought up two really important points. One is the disparities that this is causing, and like you mentioned, people of color are more affected by this, and also the sort of the state legislation here. So I'm gonna, if I can ask Yuki to comment on how do you think we can mitigate some of this, and is it something that can be addressed nationally as well, or is there something specific to the state of California that makes this more relevant to what you're looking at?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So in terms of tackling this problem, I think one major aspect of it is what Zoe was talking about, is I think other than people who are directly impacted, the statistics about how pretrial detention itself is driving the mass incarceration problem, like that's really startling, and that can be presented in these digestible statistics that if anyone took the time or was exposed to these, they can understand. But I think the other problem, and why Zoe and I were really motivated to write about this issue, is that science across the board is not as accessible as it could be to the general public. So where that's really pertinent, and where in California the Proposition 25 was really problematic, where it was advocating for this risk algorithm, is that I think a lot of people will hear something like risk algorithm, and they'll think, oh, like computers know the answer, and they'll be able to put their trust into something that they don't fully understand, just because it's so abstract. And what's the alternative? You're going to dive into the mechanisms of risk algorithms. So that was sort of our job, to try and present the information that was pertinent and make it accessible. So talking about a machine learning, it's only as smart as the data you give it. Computers don't know facts, they don't know truth, they only know how to process the information that you put in. So we, like Zoe was talking about, some of the data is arrest information, which is based on neighborhood, it's based on education, and we know that those things are extremely biased racially, and have been for a long time. Like that's something that no amount of machine learning is going to be able to counteract. And on top of that, because risk is so infrequent, it's a statistical nightmare. There's really no good way for us to be able to say we can predict risk, and in good faith, we can't know that that's an impossible scientific thing to do and kind of stand by as whatever legislators, whatever cash bond companies are trying to convince the public otherwise. So that was where I really saw a role. And I think that starting this conversation in California, being like, these risk algorithms are not a good solution, I'm hoping they'll open up a conversation about what are good solutions and take in research into account. Like Zoe mentioned, the science paper about nudges was really exciting. I think, we're not policymakers, we're just here to look at the information and use the skills that we have accumulated through our STEM training to be able to distinguish what is good problem solving and what is, what's in my mind deceptive.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I want to go back to this point that you made about science is not accessible. So I'm curious to go back to Dennis, to talk to you about what has your experience been in Boston, and also kind of related to the issues in your memos. So obviously immigration is a big part of research, and a lot of immigrants have been banned from coming into the US and so on. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of data and how data can be deceiving is a serious issue when we talk about immigration, especially at the national level, because in our two-party system, there's a lot of reduction of very complex issues into left, right, Democrat, Republican. So I think what our data shows, and our paper really relies both on social science data as well as natural science data, and I think the combination of the two really demonstrates that. When we have statutes on the books, both on federal and state levels, the interplay between them can both make more expansive definitions of immigration and illegality, and at the same time adversely affect the very taxpayers that these restrictive laws purport to protect. So we give the example of the Medicaid application law, But there are other examples, especially in terms of environmental and labor safeguards, where immigrants who, no matter if they're illegal or not, they're frequently find themselves working in these lower wage jobs. And because they don't have access to the judicial system in many cases, we're not able to prosecute some of the abuses that are also affecting their citizen, I'll throw that in air quotes, their counterparts. So I think, as individuals committed to science, committed to policy, and taking a look at the data both on the natural and social side, there are ways in which we can elucidate truths about the data that run contrary to the left-right narrative. And actually, I think those are the most productive policy conversations we can engage in. So my hope with our paper, and I think what Zoe and Yuki have done, is very interesting. I think both of those examples show that, when you really get beyond the headlines, there's more to see. So I think that's our job, really, to make sure we can spread that around in an accessible way.
Yeah, definitely agree. And thank you for making that connection between all of your work. I can definitely see kind of high level connections here. So one of the things that Yuki also mentioned is that, we're scientists that could use evidence, and we have obviously skills in data analysis, critical thinking, so we can apply our science to societal issues, but we are not sort of the decision makers who can, implement some of this. So I think my question is, and also for viewers, who are the players here, especially for both of your publications, that you think are going to implement some of the things that you would like to see? Maybe Zoe?
I don't want to go too far out of my wheelhouse here, but so Prop 25 was just voted down in California a few weeks ago during the election. So, and it's been really fascinating, because I think that's also why we were so interested in writing this paper, because on its face, when you would think that we would want to support a bill that's trying to get rid of cash bail. I mean, I didn't really go into all the problems with cash bail, but I think a lot of it goes without saying. I mean, it's discriminatory based on wealth, socioeconomic, racial, but there's a host of issues. It holds you in jail for not being able to pay bail that's usually pretty low. I mean, it makes very little sense. But the issue is, so I think a lot of people, especially with us as scientists, like I had people ask me, how could you oppose Prop 25? You're a scientist. Of course, cash bail is bad. And, my response is like, yes, but this is just as bad. And I think there's danger in fixing a broken system with something that might perpetuate the same issues, because how much motivation is there going to be to do this again if this passes? Like it's already so hard to rally around issues when there's so much at stake all the time. So I think in terms of this, it's been really interesting to see in California who has opposed Prop 25 and who hasn't. So at first it had a lot of support from a lot of criminal justice organizations, and a lot of them ended up revoking their support when the bill got changed a little and new things were added and taken out, including like the ACLU of Southern California. They revoked their support for the same issues, that it's projected to perpetuate many of the same issues. So in terms of moving forward, I think people who voted no, it's been interesting. Los Angeles voted no in the same, I think the same split as California State. I think it was like 55-43 or something, which I think surprised a lot of people because they think of Los Angeles as this like progressive area. And I think it's a mix of people who are worried about crime increasing if cash bail is abolished, and also have heard the same issues that we're talking about here with it. And it's hard to know that split of who is opposed to getting rid of cash bail and who's opposed to worsening the issue. So I think I think that a lot of criminal justice organizations in Los Angeles are moving forward to implement reforms still. I think a lot of people were very disappointed that this didn't pass. A lot of people who wanted reform, a lot of legislators in California. And I think if there's a way to harness that that energy and that desire to reform this broken system, but just do it in a way that doesn't perpetuate the same harms, I think that could be great. I'm just not sure right now where that stands. I do know that a lot of criminal justice organizations are still working towards that. And if anything, I think the COVID epidemic also has shown, I mean, there are horror stories of people who have been in jail, again, not accused of a crime. I mean, sorry, not convicted of a crime, right? Just accused, like innocent until proven guilty. And they're there because they couldn't pay bail. And then there's a COVID-19 outbreak. So lives are at stake in even a more tangible way. And I think that's kind of renewed bail reform efforts.
Yeah, thank you. That's it's interesting to hear your thought process, and yeah, COVID definitely has impacted this. I would be curious to know what this looks like in other states as well. You've probably looked at that too, but yeah, that's really good. So I'm going to ask Dennis the same question because it seems like your issue is a little broader. And so what would you like to see as a next step after this memo?
Absolutely. I think, so in the title of our piece is Illegality in Healthcare, a Federalist Perspective. And what that implicitly acknowledges is the fact that, in our Republican system, small r Republican that is, we have an interesting interplay between the federal and state governments in healthcare and immigration. So our piece really addresses both sides of it, and we kind of use New Jersey as a case study on the state level. But in our recommendations section, we kind of touch 5 big areas. So we touch immigration status reform, we touch legal identification programs, immunization subsidy programs, executive immigration policies, so that would be on the federal level, and anonymous reporting services. So each of those, in a certain way, setting aside really the executive policies, that's more from a presidential standpoint. But each of those are really things that can be taken up by state legislatures, in a fairly quick manner. And I wonder, with the expected change in presidential administration coming up, how that will affect this. I know that healthcare, the Affordable Care Act is something that we never seem to be able to stop talking about. And there were even some policies under former President Obama in terms of Social Security and things like that, where we're at a very interesting time, especially as Zoe acknowledged, with COVID, things are changing. So I think that some of the recommendations we put forward are definitely politically tenuous, but we try to acknowledge that in our recommendations. Whether that be immigration status reform on the federal level, or that 5-year waiting period on the state level. So there are definitely things, pragmatic areas, where I think we can get both sides to the table and say, look, the data shows that this actually helps the taxpayers who put you in office, and it actually also helps the common good. And I think for some people who are reading my bio, they might be, he's a theology major. That sounds weird for a science policy discussion. But a lot of it's about really supporting the common good, and how can we bring everyone together at the table. So it definitely requires nuanced conversation, and it requires a rejection of the reductionism that is becoming all the more frequent, it seems, unfortunately. But there's definitely some things that I think both state and federal lawmakers can move forward with.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good answer. I think it's worthwhile pointing out the situation that we're currently in with COVID and new administration. So I'm wondering also what you think about the issues that you're addressing. Maybe I can ask Yuki this question. How is the current environment affecting, or how do you see this changing in the new administration? Keeping in mind COVID is also happening. So a lot is happening. What is your opinion about how this issue will change in the future?
Yeah, thank you. I think that, especially with COVID, it's highlighted a lot how, I'm going to quote Senator Holly Mitchell, who we recently had an event with, that policy is just deciding who gets what when. And I think that COVID has really highlighted and exacerbated a lot of inequalities. And I think that, a common theme across what Dennis is talking about in our cash bail paper is that, there are there's a cost and there's a benefit to all policies. And part of our evidence analysis that we wanted to do is saying, okay, public safety is really important. Pretrial detention was something that was imagined in order to address, the cost that people being put into pretrial detention would have, and the benefit would have to society to keep it safe. And the evidence is really, 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 really clear that there are certain people who are paying the cost, and that there are underlying biases that are determining who pays those costs. And I think we're seeing, that's a theme across policy. So I'm really hoping that overall this conversation about inequities, which I think people are starting to pay more and more attention to, and I think, it does a lot of what Dennis was saying, that things tend to be kind of presented black and white and be left and right. And we really want the evidence to be able to speak for ourselves. We want to be able to print the information, the studies, the statistics that were done, and the history, taking in social aspects as well as the scientific, and say, like, the patterns are clear, they're irrefutable. And this is the evidence of what has worked and what hasn't. And yeah, I think that's our role. And I think that continuing that trajectory of examining the issues and the contributors and potential solutions is our job.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for making those points. Zoe, did you have anything to add?
No, not really. I think everything Yuki said is spot on. I think in LA, one thing that's interesting in terms of current climate is, the district attorney has a big say in these types of, specifically for our paper and these types of decisions. And Los Angeles just elected a pretty progressive DA, George Gascon. And I think and I hope that some of these issues we bring up might be addressed in practice, even without sweeping legislation. And because, one of the things that Yuki was just saying too, which, pretrial detention is something that people don't think about as much as in terms of mass incarceration, but something that's so solvable, it's so addressable, and it's such a singular point that can just make such a difference. And I think even if there's not some sort of sweeping bill or sweeping legislation yet, even just decisions by specific people in Los Angeles County or in wherever would have a huge effect in helping the lives of a lot of people who are affected by this. So hopefully that might be happening in LA County.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think that's really valuable. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, I want to see if you have some advice or can talk a little bit about your experience with publishing in JSPG, and if you have some advice to early career researchers who are listening and would like to do this, and how, again, keeping in mind this environment that we're in, how can they get engaged in policy and what kinds of things should they think about?
So first, I want to compliment the JSPG team. You guys are really incredible, and the feedback we got was fantastic. One thing I'd say on the recommendation side is for those early career researchers, perhaps in social science fields, don't shy away from our natural science counterparts. I co-authored my piece with someone who studies biochemistry, public health, and I think the interplay between the social science and the natural science is where we see the most fruitful research, because sometimes lawmakers, either by choice or for otherwise, shy away from the complex data tables and pie charts. So sometimes be able to loop it in with some real world experience and kind of put a face to the stories we tell about. Incarceration, that's a very personal thing. People really have to experience that. It's the same thing with immigration. We hear stories all too often of people who are immigrating and who really struggle, and I think the coronavirus has only made that more difficult for everyone. So what I would say is really think about different ways your work can become interdisciplinary, because I think that's where we create the most productive conversations. And as Zoe said, sweeping legislation is a big word that everyone wants to hear. It rarely actually happens. But if you tackle an issue, in my case, it was immigration and healthcare, and Zoe and Yuki's case, it's incarceration. When you tackle that from a data perspective, but also incorporating, the history of it, the reality on the ground, I think that's where we lessen the gap between the academy and the real world. And I think that's something, both sides can benefit from.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you. And I'm glad you made this point about interdisciplinarity. Definitely something to consider moving forward. And then Yuki?
Yeah, I wouldn't, I mean, I don't feel super comfortable being like, I have a whole lot of experience with this, but my only recommendation would be to get involved. I think that writing is a really powerful communication tool, and as scientists, we're all going to write a lot, but it might be for manuscripts, it might be for grants, and I think that engaging in communication and kind of brushing up on our non-hard science writing skill set is I imagine that this is going to be incredibly valuable moving forward. So yeah, my recommendation would be to do it.
That's helpful. Yeah. And I think, it's good advice, because a lot of early career researchers don't think they have the expertise. They don't even know where to start. And, so saying this is, I agree with you, just start from somewhere, and then, you get experience. And for a lot of them, publishing in JSPG is the first time they've written something like this, and, going through the experience, hopefully is valuable. And then if we can just have Zoe comment as well.
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you. I don't think I have much to add beyond what Dennis and Yuki already said. I think the point of the interdisciplinary nature of this is a great one. I also think the first thing that came to mind is what was just said, which is that the only advice I would give would be just try it. I mean, I think we tend to think like, I'm a neuroscientist, so I write neuroscience papers, but having the opportunity to go really in depth on something that either you research or your research tangentially touches, neuroscience and criminal justice are so intertwined, but it's not like in my PhD, I have a reason to go super, super in depth in one aspect of that. And this kind of gave me that. And I mean, our co-authors, so, Yuki is, gene regulation, molecular biology, and neuroscience. Our Jonathan Balk, who is another co-author, he was an undergrad who now works at Rand, and he was like, did stuff with NASA. Kanan Mori was an undergrad. She was like public health, developmental biology. There's all these different fields that come together. And I've learned so much writing these memos. And I think the point that Yuki made about scientific versus, or not scientific, but more, academic versus trying to write in a way that speaks to a broader audience it's still pretty niche, but it's broader, I think has been so valuable and important. And I think it's opened a lot of doors too, just from this, we've written other things about this issue. We're doing this, I think we just shouldn't feel limited by our training or the fields that we're in. I think we're taught a lot of really valuable skills as scientists that we can use to influence a lot of different areas of society, because otherwise what's the point? I mean, that's the point. I think that we all want to do things to better society, so I think JSPG has given us such a great opportunity to be able to do that.
Great, that's great to hear. And I think a really good point to end on for ECRs who are listening to this and want to affect society, and how JSPG can do that. And we're looking to expand, beyond just the publication process that you're getting to, these podcasts and webinars and other things we'll be doing. So hopefully it will be more opportunities in the future to discuss the great work that you all have published. So thank you. So just to wrap up then, thank you to our guests today, and thank you everybody for joining us. You can find this episode and others like it on JSPG's YouTube channel and on SoundCloud. And that's it for this week's episode on SciPol SoundBites, the podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal.